I want to welcome even people who are home this morning. We have a fairly decent one of the larger crowds we've had since we started coming back indoors. But I believe we still have quite a number of people at home watching, and so hopefully you guys are able to participate at least in this Bible study at some level. Christmas is here. It's been a long one. It's been a long 2020. Some people said to me, 2020 felt like 5 years, but it just felt like a year for me, but it was a little bit long. And this year certainly has been a little bit different, right? We've never really kind of experienced. I think there were some things back in the late 70s that disrupted life a little bit, and maybe not quite as much as this, but this, that we are celebrating Christmas, remains the same. And we continue to celebrate the secular holiday that is Christmas. We continue to celebrate the secular holiday that is Christmas. And you're like, wait a minute here, that doesn't sound quite right to me. That's a religious holiday. And I say, well, I'm not so sure it really is. You know, we buy the presents, we set up the Christmas tree, we cook the Christmas goose, right? These are all secular traditions, right? People set up their holiday lights and their Satan clauses, and then they set up their nativity scenes right next to it. So, I mean, I don't know if we can really say religious holiday. We are celebrating something about the Word of God during the time of a secular holiday. That's really what's going on here. Christmas is really kind of it's really its origins were secular, pagan even. So we're celebrating some Christian truths that we find in the Word of God at the same time that a secular holiday is celebrated. Well, anyway, I say every year during this time of year that Christ is thought of and remembered as a sweet, innocent, helpless babe. And everybody loves a sweet, innocent, helpless, right? Who doesn't love a little baby? Who doesn't love Baby Yoda right now? Baby Yoda, like everybody loves little Baby Yoda, right? Nobody even knows who he is. Half people don't even know who he is, but they love Baby Yoda, right? And who doesn't love a little baby? You get to hold the little baby. I'm a little concerned about holding babies, because listen, I've done it quite a bit, so maybe I'm not as concerned as much today. But there was a time where I was afraid to pick up a baby. I was like, oh man, am I going to hurt the baby? Am I going to drop the baby? Now it's not that big of a deal, but I'm concerned about my wife picking up a baby, because if she picks up a baby, she's going to want a baby, and the factory is shut down in my mind. But anyway, so we think of Jesus as this sweet, innocent, helpless little babe, but we don't think of him as the all-powerful King of the universe, the one to whom we must give account. And I would say that mindset that we have is slightly misguided. And I would say that this time of year, we're often considering maybe the wrong aspects of who Jesus is. Really, not even an aspect of who Jesus is. More like we're celebrating an event that the early church never celebrated, rather than the work of the person of Christ. Today, we're going to look at one of the most important prophecies about the birth of the Messiah. And what this is supposed to say was, let me go ahead and fix it. I think I can fix it. There. A little town of Bethlehem? Is that really what this passage is about so much? Today we're going to look at one of the most important prophecies about the birth of the Messiah. And yet we're going to see that Bethlehem, though significant in the prophecy, is not the point. And we're going to see that the birth of the Messiah, though significant in the prophecy, is not really the key idea. Something else stands out, something considerably more significant. Now, I want to set the stage for you a little bit. And it's going to take a little time to set the stage. So it's not going to feel like a Christmas message for a little bit. Okay, so the next 10, 15 minutes, let's say 10 minutes or so, I want to set the stage for what's going on. Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to understand what Micah is actually saying in Micah 5, 2 through 5, which is really the prophecy of the birth of the Messiah. If we don't look at the context, we're not going to get it. We're going to misunderstand it. And so you should know that the days of the prophet Micah, they're dark days. He's ministering during troubling times in Israel. Israel is divided, and I have a map here to kind of show you this. Israel is divided. You might remember that during the days of, after Solomon, during the days of Rehoboam, that the kingdom of Israel split. And after Solomon, you basically have, can you see this? I think the color's wrong. Let me see if I can switch this color real quick. There we go. Maybe you can see that a little better. Can you see that better? You have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the kings from the line of David ruled down here in the south. And the kings from the line of Jeroboam, they ruled from up here. And it wasn't just the sons of Jeroboam. There was a couple of kings from Jeroboam, and then that was replaced by another dynasty, which was replaced by another dynasty, and so on. Well, anyway, this northern kingdom of Israel is apostate. We're dealing with like the 700s right now, 700 BC, and these guys are apostates. They set up idols, places of worship in Dan and in Bethel. Now, I know you can't really see the names of those cities, but that's that. They set these places of worship up so that all the people in Israel would go worship in these two places and not worship the Lord in Jerusalem. To make matters worse, so these guys are apostate. The northern kingdom of Israel, they're apostate. But to make matters worse, the southern kingdom of Judah is playing around with apostasy all the time. They're worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Right? They're worshiping gods where some of these kings are burning their children as offerings to Molech or Chemosh, to these gods of Ammon and Moab. And so both of these nations are really kind of not in a great place with God. During the time we're looking at, right around this time, Judah is actually, it's not as ugly as it seems, or at least it won't be as ugly as it seems, because they're going to have a king. They're going to have a king who brings them back to the Lord. And every time Judah starts spiraling away, a king comes like Hezekiah or like Joash or like Josiah, who kind of brings them back to worship the Lord. But there's one point where the book of the law is lost. It's lost. It's kind of hidden under the 55-year reign of terror of Manasseh. That hasn't happened yet in what we're looking at today. But this is kind of where Israel and Judah are. They're not with God. They're not in a good place with God. And to make matters even worse than that is you have an empire, the Assyrian Empire, that is growing. And these dudes are not good. The Assyrians are not good at all. They've been a threat for quite some time, and they've invaded Israel several times in the past, and now they're growing more and more powerful. And the next invasion into Israel, which, by the way, Israel would be this tiny little mouse in the midst of huge cats, right? Tiny little Jerrys in the midst of huge Toms. I watched a few minutes of Tom and Jerry last night. At one point, Tom got Jerry, and he had him like, eat him, finish him off, and the mouse just slipped right out. Couldn't even believe it. I'm always left unsatisfied watching Tom and Jerry. Anyway, in this case, we're rooting for the tiny little mouse, right? And they're a tiny little mouse. But look at the size, just the sheer size of the nation of Israel. And by the way, that's a pretty inaccurate. Let's go with more like that is Israel, and this is the empire of Assyria. And they're growing larger and more powerful, and the next invasion into Israel could be the last. At this point, at the time of the writing of Micah, Assyria is preparing for a final invasion, a final push into Israel. And so Israel's facing some tough times. Micah's ministering during some scary times, and he is serving, by the way, this southern kingdom of Judah, okay? But he has a message for the northern kingdom of Israel, and the message is really for both nations. It's a message of judgment. This is the context. This is the context of the prophecy in Micah 5. Now, I got to tell you a few more things about this context, so just kind of hang on a little bit for a few more minutes. Micah tells of God's judgment against Israel and Judah, both nations. He writes about God's judgment of Israel and Judah in chapters 1 and 2. He writes about God's judgment of their political and spiritual leaders in chapter 3. And we pick up, still dealing with the context, in chapter 4 and verse 9. And I want to read a few verses here at the end of chapter 4, just to really help you see in the text what we're dealing with when it comes to the context of the passage. We're going to get to stuff about Jesus, okay? So just hang with me. You're not going to understand the stuff about Jesus properly if you don't understand this context. Micah 4, verse 9. Now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished, that agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth? You guys are crying. You're crying out. Isn't there a king to deliver you? Where's your counselor? That agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth. That pain has gripped you. Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion. I went the wrong direction, sorry. Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. By the way, Zion is just another name for really Jerusalem. Okay, Jerusalem and Judah for that matter. Writhe and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon. Let me switch those colors back so you could go back to yellow. Go to Babylon. We see judgment against Israel, but what stands out is the mention not of Assyria, but of Babylon. Babylon isn't even on the scene yet, okay? And they won't be for some time. We're at the height of Assyrian power. Babylon won't be on the scene really for maybe another 100 years. I mean, they're on the scene, but they're not going to be a superpower for maybe another almost 100 years. Assyria is the biggest superpower the world has seen. They would take, at that point, women and children as captives. They would skin their enemies alive. They would strip their captives naked and impale their bodies on stakes to let them sit there and let the birds eat them. One Assyrian king was said to tear off the lips and hands of his victims. And so the thought of the destruction at the hand of Assyria is a scary thought. And yet Micah says that Zion, Jerusalem, will be exiled to Babylon, not to Assyria. And so there's kind of like a message of judgment here. Listen, the northern kingdom of Israel, they're going to fall. They're going to fall and they're going to be taken to Assyria. But the southern kingdom of Judah, they're going to fall too. Just not yet. They're going to fall as well, just not yet. Micah tells of a time when Jerusalem and Judah would be taken to Babylon. And this is because they had broken the Sinai covenant. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. They had broken the covenant with the Lord. They had continuously gone to worship other gods, and they'll face judgment. And they will lose their city because of it. They'll lose their king and their kingdom. It's the worst news that you could possibly hear. Makes 2020 seem like a joke. We're going to lose everything. We're going to lose our nation. We're going to lose our kingdom. We're going to lose our homes. Maybe our families. We're going to be taken out of our land and made servants somewhere else. Worst news you could possibly hear. And who knows, for those who were spared immediate judgment, who knows what types of evil the Babylonians would do? It's a disaster that would strike fear into the hearts of the people of Israel if they believed what God said, which half the time they didn't. Half the time they just blew off the prophets. Sometimes imprisoned them, like Jeremiah, sometimes killed them. Yet we see here this promise, just this little bit, this little tidbit, this little promise of deliverance. There's going to be a day when Israel would be redeemed from the hands of their enemies, where Israel would be rescued from the hands of the Babylonians. And so this threat of destruction would ultimately turn into victory. But look at this in verses 11 and 12. And now many nations have assembled against you, who say, let her be polluted and let our eyes gloat over Zion. Let's brag. Let's rejoice over the destruction of Israel. And by the way, some of those nations that did that were seen right around the people of Israel. The Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites. They were happy to see Israel fall. They were happy to see him fall. Anyway, Now, let our eyes gloat over Zion, but they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they do not understand his purpose, for he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. These nations would rejoice over Israel, over their destruction, but what they didn't realize is when they gathered together against them, there would be a point in time where they would gather together against Israel, but it wasn't for victory. When those nations gathered against Israel, it would be for defeat. Look, God, they didn't understand the thoughts of the Lord. They didn't understand his purpose. He gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. Now, so Israel is an agricultural society, and they would grow grain and wheat, and they would take the sheaves of grain to the threshing floor, and they would separate the wheat from the chaff, and the wheat would be used. It would be life-sustaining food for the community. The chaff would be destroyed or just be carried off with the wind. All right. And so the nations are the chaff that would be judged by the Lord. Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion, for your horn I will make iron, and your hoofs I will make bronze, that you may pulverize many peoples, that you may devote to the Lord their unjust gain, and their wealth to the Lord of all the earth. That is, these nations would be destroyed by Israel. So there's your context. Your context is there's going to be judgment against Israel, but eventually a remnant is going to be restored. A small group of people is going to be restored, and eventually the nation of Israel is going to destroy the nations around them. By the way, that hasn't happened yet. That hasn't happened yet. One of the reasons why it's so important that we maintain, some of that's happened, but they haven't destroyed the nations around them yet, not in this extent. You may say, some of the wars in the 1940s, whatever. This happens much later on. And it's why it's so important for us to maintain a good relationship with Israel as long as we can, because eventually we're going to be one of those nations that come against Israel. I don't think our next president is too friendly to Israel. At least when he was vice president, his president wasn't friendly with Israel. Former President Barack Obama was one of the worst friends that Israel's ever had in the White House. And I fear that might be the case in the next 4 years as well. Anyway, Israel would face judgment from the nations, but even in the midst of this restoration that would happen, look at verse 5, and this is the last verse of our context. Now muster yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With a rod they will smite the judge of Israel. They will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. Anyone want to take a guess who this judge of Israel is? Anyone want to take a guess? Is that a hand, Chad? Chad says, Jesus Christ. Anyone agree? All agree? Raise your right hand. All disagree? Raise your hand. So we have no thoughts whatsoever. We have one thought in the entire congregation. And that one thought, what's that? They're abstaining. Many times, if we just answer God or Jesus, kids have learned this in Sunday school class. It's the right answer, right? What's that? It's the Sunday school answer. If you ask a question, if you say God or Jesus, 9 times out of 10, the answer is right. This is the 1 time out of 10, Chad. This is the 1 time out of 10. And I'll show you that. If you read this without its preceding context, the natural thing, if we're just thinking Micah 5 verses 1 through 5, we're thinking this is Jesus. Exactly. And we're thinking this is New Testament, everything that happened to Jesus at the cross. But that's not what's actually going on here, or at least that's not likely what's going on here. This judge will not be able to stop the siege against Israel. This judge would be smitten by the rod. He would not be powerful to stop the nations from coming against Israel. We don't know for sure who this judge is. But most likely, it's Zedekiah, the last king, or at least most probably, it's the last king of Judah, Zedekiah. A king who couldn't stop the siege of Babylon against Jerusalem. A king who tried to escape and didn't make it. Who got captured, who had to watch his sons get killed in front of his own eyes at the town of Riblah. And then, after seeing his sons murdered by the Babylonians, they gouged out his eyes. This is the last thing you're ever going to see. And that is a judgment of a king who refused to listen to what God says. This judge would not be able to stop the siege against Israel. And so we see at this point, all is lost. Up through Micah 5 and verse 1, and I know that was a long context, but it was important. All seems lost. Even the judge would be smitten on the cheek. Even the judge would not be able to stop the siege against us. The siege that would ultimately lead to Israel being taken away to Babylon. All is lost. The great judgment against Israel and Judah. We have a glimpse of restoration. We know there's going to be a day when there's a restoration that happens. But for now, all seems lost. In chapter 5, beginning with verse 2, Micah writes about that restoration. He reverses the whole course of things. And that reverse of the whole course of things is seen so clearly by the use of, in English at least, and I would say also in the original language, by the use in the original language of one letter. But the context makes it clear that this is a letter of contrast. Everything you have just read about, as bad as that is, as bad as the destruction of Israel is, as bad as the smiting of that judge who would be unable to stop the siege, as bad as the destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria and the southern kingdom of Judah by Babylon, as bad as all of that is, here's some good news. Here's some contrasting news, some good news. The news of the restoration that would happen through the birth of the Messiah. Look at verse 2. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, which is just another way of saying Bethlehem, it's dealing with the clan of the people of Bethlehem. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. And this is really kind of the section I want to just deal with for a second here. Notice where the birth takes place. It takes place in Bethlehem, Bethlehem Ephrathah, right? Which is, check this out, only if we were to zoom in. Now remember, what we're doing is we've got this big, huge area with this big, huge cat and this tiny little mouse right down in here, right? And if we zoom in on this tiny little area here, and we keep zooming in on this tiny little area, we would have something like that size. All right, so we keep zooming in on that tiny little area, and we're going to see the city of Jerusalem. And one of the best ways to find Jerusalem on a map is to go to the very northern tip of the Dead Sea, draw a line over to the Mediterranean, and go about a third the way. And that's how you find Jerusalem. Okay. Well, anyway, you have Jerusalem, but about 5 miles south, you have this tiny little city, which isn't a whole lot bigger than our church grounds, named Bethlehem. And it's a small town that's in the shadow of the big city, the city of God. And it has history. This little town has some history. Rachel died and was buried there in Bethlehem. Ruth married Boaz in Bethlehem in Ruth 4. King David was born in the city of Bethlehem in Ruth 4 and 1 Samuel 16. And this king in Micah 5, this king, this ruler will be born right there in the city of Bethlehem. You remember in the New Testament when King Herod wanted to find out, hey, listen, where can I find this king so that I can worship him? This passage is what they pointed to. You could find him here. You find him in Bethlehem because that's what the scriptures say. Micah's prophecy changes. Who was the audience? What town was the audience in chapter 4? At the end of chapter 4. What city was the audience? Starts with a Z. Zion, which is a reference to Jerusalem. So the audience there, all the way up through chapter 5 and verse 1, is Jerusalem. The audience here shifts. The subject matter shifts. The audience is now Bethlehem. Okay, Bethlehem is the audience, and they are too little among the clans of Judah. It's a small town compared to its neighbor. It's insignificant compared to its neighbor, Jerusalem. Listen, a couple of major events have happened at Bethlehem, but Jerusalem is where all the action is. Jerusalem is where the temple is. Jerusalem is where the Lord is worshipped. Jerusalem is where all the kings ruled from. Jerusalem is the big city. Bethlehem is just a shadow. But out of this small town, out of this little town, one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. Out of this small town will come forth the Messiah. There's a huge difference, by the way, between this guy and the guy in verse 1. There's a huge difference between this ruler and the powerless ruler of verse 1. That ruler was judged by the nations. This powerful ruler will judge the nations. Again, during Micah's day, Israel is divided into two nations. Messiah, he will rule all of Israel. He will rule in Judah and in Israel. He will rule the entire area and beyond. This king is the Messiah, and there's no question over it. There's no question that this king is a reference to the Messiah. Ancient Jewish interpreters thought he was the Messiah. The ancient Jewish targums, like commentary, they called him the Messiah. Matthew understood this to be the Messiah, and so did Luke. This king that's being spoken of here in verse 2, this king is the Messiah. Notice what Micah says about this future ruler. His goings forth are from of old, from long ago, from the days of eternity. This ruler existed in eternity past. He is no mere human. He existed long before his birth in Bethlehem. Look at John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. And verse 14 makes it abundantly clear, and 1 John makes it clear that this word is a reference to Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. This ruler existed long before his birth, his human birth in Bethlehem, long before he took on flesh. The pre-existence of the Messiah is not just a New Testament idea. It's something that was taught all the way back in the days of Micah, which is over 700 years before the birth of Christ. At this point, Micah returns to a theme he's already written about, the temporary judgment and restoration of Israel in verse 3. Therefore, he will give them up. He will give up Israel and Judah until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. She who is in labor, who's that? What's that? Who's the child? It's not Baby Yoda. Who's the child? Child is Messiah, right? Which we know to be Jesus, right? Who is she who is in labor? Not Mary, but Israel. Israel. Okay. She who is, therefore, he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel. So what a lot of people think is, this has been fulfilled. All this has been fulfilled. Well, it hasn't been fulfilled yet. Some of it has been fulfilled, but it doesn't get fulfilled until the nation of Israel returns to its Messiah. One day the Messiah will come and rule the nations. One day he will unify the people of Israel. One day all the nations around him will be in submission to him, and ruled by him. The nations will come to the Messiah. Israel will convert to its Messiah. That hasn't happened yet. Some people think this happened. Some of this happened at the time of the birth of Christ, and the rest of it happened in 1948 when Israel returned to its land. Or maybe in 538, 536, Cyrus made his decree, and Cyrus was the king of Babylon who let Israel come back, who let the southern kingdom of Judah come back to the land. And he took over around 539 BC, and he made a decree that Israel could return to its land. Around 538, it probably returned around 536 or so, right? It's not that time. It's not 1948 either. This has not been fulfilled yet. This doesn't get fulfilled until Israel turns to their Messiah, until Christ comes back. This is fulfilled when Christ reigns over Israel and all the earth for 1,000 years and for all eternity. And so this passage, if you look at the passage, is the focus really on Bethlehem? Can you read this passage and say that, the real focus of this is Bethlehem? The real focus of this is the birth of Messiah. I'm not saying they're not issues. I'm not saying they're not factors. I'm not saying they're not important ideas in the passage, but that's not really what the passage is pointing us to. The passage is pointing us to the ultimate restoration that happens through the Messiah. The ultimate reversal of fortunes that happens through the Messiah. Notice what Micah says about the Messiah in verse 4 in the beginning of verse 5. And he will arise and shepherd his flock. He's going to be their king. He will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. His glory will be clear and seen throughout the entire earth, and Israel's going to flock to him, and he's going to be their king. That's really the focus of the passage here. Verse 5, this one will be our peace. The Messiah will shepherd his people. He'll be a great shepherd king to his flock, and he will bring peace. Notice what's said about him in Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. For a child will be born to us. A son will be given to us. And the government, and this is also in that same general time frame that Isaiah is writing. Isaiah writes between 740 BC and let's call it 690 BC. So he's kind of contemporary with Hosea a little bit. All right. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. This hasn't been fulfilled yet. We're awaiting this fulfillment. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Actually, eternal is the right word here. King James says everlasting. Eternal is the right word. Why is eternal the right word? Theologically speaking. Everlasting means going on forever in the future. Eternal means everlasting in both directions, right? So Jesus is the eternal. His name will be called the Eternal Father. The Messiah's name will be called the Eternal Father, the Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. Isaiah understands that it's the rule of Christ that really stands out more than the birth of Christ. The birth of Christ is just, it's necessary. It's necessary for it to happen. It's significant, don't get me wrong, but it's not the point. The point is his rule, his power, his authority, his rule. Isaiah will go on just a couple of chapters later in Isaiah 11 to describe this Messiah's rule. Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. A branch from his roots will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. We're talking about the Messiah, right? And even though the birth is referenced here at some level, it's by no means the overarching theme. In any of these passages, verse 3, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make decisions by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness. This is going to be perfectly righteous rule. And decide with fairness for the afflicted of the earth. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and with the breath. He's not going to be smitten by the nations. He's not going to be unable to stop the siege. He will be the one who strikes the earth with the rod of his mouth. And we read about that at the end of Revelation 19. And with the breath of his lips, he will slay the wicked. Also, righteousness will be the belt about his waist, his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb. Can you imagine that? Wolf. Doesn't the wolf attack the lambs? Doesn't the wolf eat the lambs? Right? The wolf will dwell with the lamb. And the leopard. Ever watch a leopard chase after a young goat or a gazelle or something like that? I always cheer for the leopards, right? I'm like, anyone ever watch Big Cats? Nobody else watched that? Oh, I loved that show. You'd sit there and watch the cat for like 10 minutes and you'd see him waiting for the prey, and you're like, just go. And then he'd pounce and be like, yes. And then the gazelle would get away. And he's like, so unsatisfying, right? But every once in a while you'd see him get the cat. But here, the leopard will lie down with the young goat. What are we seeing? We're seeing that sin is diminished. The calf and the young lion and the fatling together. A lion and a calf together? The lion's just going to sit down with its meal? Are you kidding me? When the lion walks by, do you know what the cattle do? They run, right? They see a lion, they get out. They get out. Which, by the way, I think if they took a stand, I think they'd take down the lion personally. But think about it. All of them go after, but whatever. They don't know that. And a little boy will lead them. Also, the cow will bear. Also, the cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together. And the lion will eat straw. Like the ox eats straw. The nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra. A little kid, little baby. Reach his hand right by the hole. Okay, look, there's the cobra right there. It's not going to harm. And the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples. And his resting place will be glorious. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people, who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar is Babylon, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. One day, the Messiah will rule the world, will rule Israel and the world, and he'll restore Israel and Judah. We see a partial fulfillment of that at Jesus' birth. We see a partial fulfillment of that. We could read about Jesus' birth at in the little town of Bethlehem. You could read about it really in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. You could read about it in Luke chapter 2. And we will read those passages on Christmas Eve, I'm sure, in Luke 2, 1 through 7. And we could spend so much time thinking about the birth of Christ this time of year. And I personally, again, think that's slightly misguided because it's not his birth that's ultimately the point. It's not his birth that ultimately fulfills Micah's prophecy. It's his rule. It's not even his death and resurrection that fulfills Micah's prophecy. It's his rule. A rule that we see finally fulfilled in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6. And let me read those for you. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand, and he laid hold of that dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the bottomless pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. He would ultimately be destroyed at the end of that 1,000 years. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and who had not received the mark on their forehead or on their hand. By the way, the vaccine is not the mark of the beast. Just please, okay, read Revelation. This is something that keeps coming up over and over and over and over and over again. The mark of the beast is not something you can take by accident. It's something that happens after the rapture. It's something that happens at least at the middle point of the tribulation period, when the Antichrist has been made known, when the false prophet's been pointing people to worship him, and all this type of stuff. It's not something that you can take by accident by taking a vaccine. Okay, it's not something you can take by accident. Anyway. And those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead or on their hand, and they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Let's remember that Jesus is the great ruler of the universe. He is not the helpless ruler who couldn't stop the siege or who was smitten on the cheek by the Assyrians or by the Babylonians. He is not helpless like little baby Yoda or like the newborn infant. All right? He is the all-powerful ruler of the universe, and he will rule over the earth for 1,000 years and for all eternity. And everyone will answer to him. Everyone. Does Micah know all this? In 700 some BC, does Micah know this? In the mid-8th century BC, unlikely that he knows all of this. Maybe, maybe not. In Micah's day, we see dark and gloomy days. We see days of judgment, days of punishment, days of exile, days that make 2020 look like a joke again. But we also see the birth of the Messiah King. We see the restoration of Israel that takes place through the Messiah King, and we see the rule of that Messiah King. We see that God will keep his promises to Israel. And praise the Lord that we're beneficiaries of that promise. By faith and the work of Christ on the cross, we have everlasting life. By faith in the work of Christ on the cross, we inherit the promises with Israel, and we will one day reign with him. And so when I ask you what Micah's about, after reading through the passage, I hope you don't turn around and say, it's about the birth of Jesus, or it's about Bethlehem, birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. Those are elements, not insignificant. That is, they're relatively significant elements. But what this is really about is the restoration of Israel through the Messiah. So I would ask, would you place your faith in Jesus, the Messiah, today? Will you commit your life to Jesus, the Messiah? Jesus is the Messiah King that Micah writes about, that Isaiah writes about, that so many others prophets write about, that Matthew and Luke and the Gospels write about. Jesus is the Messiah King who was born in Bethlehem, yes. but who will rule the world for 1,000 years and for all eternity. If you're here today, Brother Paul, you could come forward and we're going to have a closing hymn. But if you're here today and you're not sure you're saved, you're not sure you have everlasting life, would you just come and see me or see Brother Paul or see Brother Andrew or Brother Tim Metcalf? See one of us and or Brother Joe and talk to us about. Tell us you're not sure you're saved. Tell us you're not sure. Or if you're online, you're listening at home, you're not sure you're saved, then reach out. Send an email to the church. Reach out to me. I'm not going to get my number online because who knows who would hear it and prank call me. But anyway, send us an email and reach out to me, and we'd be happy to explain to you how you can be saved by faith in the completed work of Christ on the cross. You're here and you want to just there are aspects of your life that you're not right with God, and you want to repent and you want to get right with God. As we sing, you can take care of that right now, Brother Paul.